Hey, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon and welcome back. Very happy to see all of you today. I hope that you're doing well and that you feel ready to go. We're going to have a very interesting discussion today about parties, voters, elections, and democracy. So far in the class this week, we've been talking about why parties are so important and what we rely on them for and what functions they perform. This discussion has been pretty introductory so far. We've talked about internal characteristics of parties, objectives of parties. Now I want to begin to get into how parties, different electoral fates might affect support for democracy, might affect attitudes about democracy. And more generally, I want to investigate the relationships between parties, elections, and democracy. But before we get started, um, we need to have a talk about a few issues and items that relate to what we do in here and how we handle the course. The first thing that I need to talk to you about is just a clarification regarding the purposes of lecture and office hours. There appears to be some confusion about what exactly we do in here and what the purpose of lecture is versus office hours. I just need to clarify and be totally clear. Lecture is not for reviewing assigned reading. We cover material that's not in the reading, and we do not cover every point from the reading. Office hours, on the other hand, are for reviewing assigned reading. So if you have questions about the assigned reading, I encourage you, please visit me during those office hours or set up an appointment. I have 3 office hours every week that I hold. Students can walk in as needed to address the reading or any questions that they have. I'm also happy to meet with you outside of office hours if neither scheduled time works for you. I have hours on Wednesday and Friday. Um, I just need to be clear that conventionally, this is how it's done. We don't address the reading during lecture. The lecture is devoted to a lecture and teaching. And if you're a student who needs attention to the reading and would like to discuss the reading, please come and see me. That's what I have the 3 office hours for. By contrast, we have very limited time in lecture. We don't have much time. And so we're very hard pressed to make the most of the time that we do have. And so what I just ask you is that you respect this convention and that you recognize my right to deliver a lecture and to engage in teaching and to carry out the lesson plan that I prepare before I come to class each day. So we just need to be crystal clear about that. And I encourage you and I invite you to visit me during office hours so that we can address any questions that you have. We really have a lot of time to do that. And what I can tell you is that I do see students most days that I have office hours, but there's still a lot of time that's available for anyone who would like to stop by. You can walk in virtually whenever you want. The second issue that I have to address is a little bit more serious and something that I don't take lightly at all, and that frankly I'm a little upset about personally. This relates to enforcement of the late policy. As you know, we've been under very difficult circumstances for more than a year, and we've been hard pressed often to complete things in as timely a manner. We've faced a variety of different challenges, but things have begun to get out of hand. And I'm afraid that too many students are beginning to take advantage of the circumstances and perhaps my flexibility and my willingness to accommodate a variety of different situations. It's getting to a point where it's no longer feasible for me to accommodate students in this way. We have such a large number of students in the class. We have more than 80 students just in this class. And so it's not possible to continue on the path that we're on Students are beginning, in some cases, to take advantage of the circumstances. Some students have begun lying about late work. And at this stage, it's putting me in positions that are too perilous and that I cannot be in. And so I've got to begin enforcing the late policy that is on the syllabus and that was laid down from day one, but that I, generally speaking, have been until now kind of waiving in a kind of flexible and accommodating way, given the nature of the pandemic. But the following changes will be made given the ways that this situation has begun to spin out of control. First, no extensions will be granted. Second, no late work will be accepted without documented proof of an emergency. Third, late work submitted without proof of an emergency will receive a 0. And fourth, students caught lying will be reported to student conduct. I hold people to a high standard, and this is a difficult conversation for me to have. Um, but the situation cannot continue. We have too many students, and it's just out of hand. And so I thank you for hearing me out and for taking notice and for changing your behavior as necessary. If you're a student who feels as though this doesn't apply to you, but you now feel hemmed in, I'm very sorry. But we just simply cannot allow the situation to be taken advantage of. And I think that this is another reminder that, as the saying goes, this is why we can't have nice things. And so that's the last comment I'll make about this. But I do hope that you'll take this seriously and do your best to discipline yourself if this is a problem. The vast majority of you, it's not. But again, as a reminder, because the class is so large, even a moderate number of students who seek this sort of situation can present challenges that are just too difficult to manage for me as a single individual. Of course, if you have an emergency in documentation, that's a separate story. But what I'm saying is that the flexibility that I originally was working from has now begun to I think invite too much abuse and potential abuse. So thank you for hearing me out on this, and I hope that we can accept and address this in a very adult-like way and move on and move forward. And I trust that we can, because I've consistently been impressed by the quality of your work and your engagement, and I know that we are very very professional and adult-like, and we do our best. So I trust that we can take this in stride. Thank you for hearing this, and I hope that you'll meet me halfway. Um, so we are discussing parties, and so far we've been addressing these general questions about the functions of parties and the relationships between parties. And, well, we've talked about different relationships between parties and voters and what parties do uh, as a function in a democracy. But the questions that we haven't addressed relate mainly to the links between parties' elections and democracy, and in particular, how parties can affect behavior of citizens and voters. And because this is a class on political behavior, I thought that it would be most useful for us to study and analyze really the relationships between parties' elections and support for democracy by thinking about how parties' electoral fates affect attitudes and support for democracy, either in advanced countries like the United States or emerging and transitional democracies where institutions may be more fragile and where support for democracy may be more in question at that early stage. And the three questions that we'll address in terms of this discussion of parties, elections, and democracy are the following. First, what are the links between parties, elections, and democracy? Second, how do parties' electoral fates affect support for democracy? And then third, where will partisan detractors of democracy be concentrated. So that is to say, to the extent that people who identify with a party support or oppose democracy as a result of their experience electorally, where will they be located and what sorts of partisans will be most affected by elections? So this is going to be all about elections. And I want you to be thinking about the dynamics of competition and how competitive elections create expectations, but also how parties and voters in particular go into elections with expectations about the electoral fortunes or fates of their parties. Let's face it, oftentimes going into an election, the incumbent party or the party in power is optimistic that they'll remain in power, and their defeat can often be very demoralizing, and it can also bring about a significant political change in the environment. These are the kinds of issues that I want to engage with and have you thinking about. And the question of behavior then is now going to focus and center on voters. And so we're kind of shifting in thinking about and in mediating between parties and voters in this discussion. So we're going to begin in a very broad way. And I think that the most useful way of beginning is just pointing out some general arguments and sort of truths, if you will. Elections, by definition, link parties and democracy. Parties can't really be understood without the concept of this contest to take power between these competing political groups, right? Remember that we defined a political party as a group of people who includes people who seek to hold office, which implies an election, and then those who support them in trying to bring them to office and to keep them there once they are there. That definition implies a central role for elections, and this central role is what explains why the most minimal definitions of parties stress their electoral function. The simplest and most procedural definitions of parties always emphasize elections. And so consider Sartori in 1976, who said any political group that presents at elections and is capable of placing through elections candidates for public office. That was his definition, his minimal definition of a political party. This definition is entirely reliant on the concept or the notion of an election or a competitive contest for the people's vote. And so this relationship between parties and democracy, first and foremost, is mediated by elections. And even more importantly, though, in what we'll establish and take piece by piece now is that there's a symbiotic relationship between parties and elections. It's not just that parties compete in elections in that they form for the purpose of competing in elections. Elections also reshape parties because parties shape elections, elections shape results in the institution of a government, in governance and policies and politics. Once a government is in power, will then reshape those individual parties. And the way we can think about this is in the following way. There's sort of this cyclical relationship between parties, elections, and democracy. On the one hand, we begin sort of at time one, where in society we have political parties that are the result of the demand for distinctive representation that results from the social cleavages combined with the electoral system and the way that it incentivizes parties to form large parties or form third parties. Parties then will compete in elections, and elections produce governments, and governments govern. And the ways that governments govern will in turn affect parties. And the cycle is really a continual loop. And so it's hard for us to ever pick out precisely where we are in the process. But one way to do this is by studying new democracies and by trying to examine the founding elections in a democratic system and figure out how those founding elections affect things like voter attitudes, support for democracy, behavior, and consumption of information, support for alternative forms of government. When we think about the relationship between parties and elections, we have to, though, begin with how parties shape things like turnout or information. Can anyone tell me how parties shape voter turnout in elections?
They help with candidates' finances and doing stuff like get out the vote programs and party registration drives.
Good. So that's a sophisticated response, Ishan. Thank you. So Ishan points out in the first case, they help candidates with finances. Parties provide resources. Sometimes resources for elections are public and provided by the state, but often they're private, and it has to do with financing and fundraising that takes place within parties. So parties will finance candidates. Candidates who are better financed are often better able to convey information to voters in a meaningful and relevant way, and in doing so, generate more turnout. But directly, parties also mobilize voters. Ishan said that they get out the vote. That's exactly what they do. More parties means more mobilization, not just because individual parties mobilize voters, their voters, but each individual party means there's that much more competition, up to a certain point at least. You can imagine there being a point of no return. But a large number of parties can mean a very competitive party system. And that could mean a lot of voter mobilization, could mean higher turnout as a result. All of these things would seem to be good and favorable to democracy, more turnout, positive outcome, because it means participation and engagement with democracy. But it also might mean that voters might have expectations about how their party will do in the elections. When you have more people voting and more engaged and more mobilized, you might have more passionate voters who have a stronger set of expectations about what democratic elections should conclude with in terms of who's in the government and who wins and who loses. In other words, they want their party to win. And perhaps if their party doesn't win, it may affect their support for democracy or their attitude or their behavior in some material way. So parties in elections seem to go hand in hand. Parties in many ways will shape turnout, they will shape information, they will shape the behavior of candidates. They will shape the behavior of voters as well, to the extent that they respond to parties' mobilization efforts and in the ways that they use their finance. Absolutely. Alondra says one way is through the help of creating incentives for people to come out and vote, learn about politicians, etc. Absolutely. So parties often share in print their own information. They print their own agenda. They print voter guides often. You may remember receiving these things in the mail if you're registered with a particular party. In a lot of ways, they help to connect voters to the electoral process. They engage them in a way that they otherwise would not be engaged if those parties did not exist. So, in many ways, one thing that takes voters to the polls is the parties themselves. Ashley says, could this be what happened in the last election? How Trump supporters thought there was voter fraud and no longer believed in the voting because they lost? Ashley is all over it. We're actually going to consider in a few minutes whether the United States in recent uh, months and periods seems to be vulnerable to this sort of defection from democracy or this loss of support, popular support for democracy that comes from your side losing and disillusionment with democracy. And it's actually kind of amazing how on point Ashley is and how she is sort of anticipating the the quote that I want to share with you now. And this is a quote from Egypt and I think a study about Egypt and Tunisia, but it's a quote about Egypt, and it's so striking and so telling. Before I read it, let me check the chat because we've got one more comment. Yeah, no problem. Thank you. So this is such a telling quote. She was in a state of shock and confusion. It was one thing for the Muslim Brotherhood to win close to 40%, but how could 28% of her countrymen vote for ultra-conservative Salafi parties? She mourned not only for what she feared Egypt might become, but for a country that she could no longer recognize, a country that was no longer really hers. It raised the question, was democracy really worth it? For liberals like her, it apparently was not worth it. And this is such a telling quote because it captures the moment and the expectations and what this voter expected the outcome of the election to be. And then that disillusionment and that sort of dissonance, that kind of cognitive dissonance, or that sort of gap between expectations and then reality. She expected her party to be victorious. The outcome was far from it. They lost. And not only that, but parties whom she viewed to be uh, uncountrylike and unpatriotic prevailed and won the election. And as a result, she withdrew her support for democracy, and she threw her support behind alternative forms of government, and not just alternative forms of government, but a repressive form of military rule that took Egypt back to an earlier era in a period of really darkness that needed light. And those of you who know the situation in Egypt know that to this day the country remains under military rule and very harsh, repressive, illiberal, dark military rule. And it's telling then that we can connect and link the attitude of the voter and the expectations of the voter and the resultant disillusionment of the voter to the present political circumstances in Egypt, and really the the loss of support for democracy that might have supported the transition back to dictatorship. And the point that I want to make to you, and that comes from this, is that how voters respond to their party's loss is critical to democracy's success. Voters go into an election with a certain expectation or idea about what kind of outcome the election will produce. And based upon what election outcome actually comes about, they adjust their support for democracy and maybe reconsider alternative forms of government. And to put this in more concrete terms, in a way that thinks of this more as a set of choices that voters have, think of it this way. These citizens or these partisans whose parties lose and who expected their party to win, they face a critical choice. This is a choice between defecting from democracy and supporting an alternative form of rule like dictatorship or military rule, or remaining loyal to democracy and continuing to support democracy despite despite their party's electoral loss, despite the fact that they expected them to prevail and that in the end they lost so badly. And this is so critical because we're now connecting parties and voters to the survival of democracy itself. And if you're like me, sometimes you feel like the voter and the citizen gets a little bit lost in the shuffle when we consider the various variables that seem to determine successful democratic transitions. This perspective is very much different. We're instead focusing on how the choice of the individual voter affects support for democracy, and how this choice itself is going to be informed potentially by the electoral fate of that person, that voter's party. Before we go on, does anyone want to comment on this quote or this circumstance or this situation or this critical choice? Uh, are we overplaying the role of this citizen choice, or is it as important as we suggest? Do you have a point of view, or do you think that this quote is telling for any other reasons that we haven't discussed? Go ahead, Brittany.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on how I think this is really interesting because I think a lot of Americans felt like this in the last, like the 2016 election. And I think this feeling can either lead to rebellion or it can lead to an adoption of like new values or standards. So I think it's really interesting, or meaningful, I should say, how this person put it into words.
Yeah, I agree. That was my response too. And I think, as you describe it, it's sort of like an inflection point, and it's also been referred to as a catastrophe point, alternatively. But this is a moment, a critical juncture, like a moment where the next decision or the choice that is made will determine the future course. And it could go one of two ways, or maybe multiple ways. And in this case, that choice involves continuing to support democracy or defecting, so to speak. And in this way, this is an inflection point. And the point arises precisely because of that disillusionment, that gap between expectations and results that comes from going into an election with the expectation that your party will prevail and then finding out that they have lost. And of course, Brittany also highlights that this is very much understandable in the US context too, where we can see a lot of dissonance, as you might call it, or sort of this disillusionment or dissatisfaction with the electoral result, this feeling even that maybe democracy had malfunctioned, so to speak, in that the result could not be trusted. Yet again, this choice between defection or loyalty becomes quite clear. And what I love about this is that, once again, this is putting you and I as the voter in the driver's seat, in highlighting that our choice is quite critical to the future course of the system, and democracy in the United States and elsewhere is all really up for grabs from this perspective. And we're actually going to think about the cases of Tunisia and Egypt, because some of the most recent founding elections in new democracies the world over are in Tunisia and Egypt. In Tunisia, this was 2011 and in subsequent years. And in Egypt, it was around that time as well. And in both countries, democratic free elections, mostly free elections, took place in the wake of the Arab Spring, which, as you know, was a popular upheaval that brought about the dissolution of those repressive monarchical regimes in Middle Eastern countries like Tunisia and Egypt. These founding elections are critical moments where we can test and try to figure out, well, who is it who's becoming disillusioned with democracy? Who's the most disillusioned with democracy? And what does political support for democracy appear to hinge on when it comes down to the different partisans or the different voters of different parties or different political affiliations? And so we're using party association as a critical heuristic here. And what we're using it as a way of figuring out how the result of the election affected support for democracy among voters of different political parties. So parties or voters who identified with parties and went into the elections with certain expectations about how their their parties would fare and how they would do in the elections. And this recent research, some of the most recent research we have on this topic, um, comes from popular opinion surveys and large data sets on popular opinion and behavior in Tunisia and Egypt. And a friend of mine actually published an article with the analysis, and it's quite interesting. It's in Comparative Politics from 2019. And what he found, Sharon Gruhl with his co-author Steve Monroe, is that disillusioned losers are primarily located where the losing parties are the strongest. So that is to say, where the losers are strongest locally, voters are the most disillusioned with democracy. And what that means, in other words, is the voters who expect their parties to do the very best, but who see their parties lose, are the ones who are the most disillusioned. So the more you expected your party to win, and based upon how well represented in your area that party is, the more disillusioned you were when they did not win. And so expectations matter a great deal. And then the point that underlies this is that losers whose parties are strong locally tend to overestimate their support nationally, or losers who have a sense that their party is quite strong within their local or family group or whoever it is they talk to are the ones who overestimate their popularity on a national level and therefore expect them to do far better than they are likely to do based upon their real support. And thus they become disillusioned after the elections. This is quite interesting, isn't it? Because it suggests that expectations matter and that when you go into the election, not every political party's voters have the same idea of how well they should do based upon their experience. Now, it wasn't just the case that the most disillusioned resided where the losing parties were the strongest. It was also the case that these areas also saw the greatest increase for former autocratic regime candidates in the subsequent elections. That is to say, when the next elections came around, candidates who represented parties or groups connected to the former dictatorship did the best in those areas where the most disillusioned voters from the first elections were most heavily concentrated. This is really, really strong evidence and important evidence for the claim that parties are mediated by elections in their relationship to democracy, and elections will shape how parties affect democracy. And then, of course, democracy will affect parties. This is an important set of findings. And I think that the key takeaway is that not all political parties have voters with equal expectations of victory or loss. And the elections will then affect their support for democracy accordingly. And then it becomes a matter of targeting efforts at decentralization, creating new institutions to accommodate potential losers, and keep them invested in democracy. This information is important because transitional regimes, most critical question for them is how do we keep support for democracy? How do we build support for democracy? And how do we keep citizens invested in democratic institutions and processes? If you know where the disillusioned reside most heavily, based upon the concentration of the losing parties and how strong and popular they are, you can then create institutions and decentralized power in a way that it better accommodates them and keeps them invested in democracy. And it's interesting to consider, for example, that in India, they've done a similar set of decentralizations where they've often carved out new provinces and states and new administrative units for the purpose of better accommodating groups who either expected themselves to do better in elections or who demanded autonomy, either because they threatened democracy or because they had their own particular ethnic or religious or linguistic constitution, and they wanted to have more freedom to decide, so to speak. So it's not just Tunisia and Egypt, it's also places like India and elsewhere in Asia where identity and ethnic fragmentation produce a lot of diversity and a lot of complexity, and mean then that there can be widely differing expectations about the results of the elections, and thus widely differing impacts on support for democracy. Very interesting. The point that comes from this, in that I want you to be thinking about, really has to do with the choice that we face as individuals who might find ourselves supporting losing parties. The whole point of democracy is to have a system where the losers accept the outcome, right? It's mainly about setting up a system where the losers peacefully accept the outcome and they go home and they come back for another try at the next election. That's the whole point. So if the losers don't accept the results, if they choose to defect, well, there goes the democracy. The rules only exist on paper. They've got to be complied with and obeyed by the actors. They've got to be played within and accepted by the players. And so the losing parties become quite important. Interestingly enough, even though they didn't win the election, they become important because the supporters of losing parties face this choice between remaining within the democratic system or defecting. And if they choose to defect because they are disillusioned with democracy, they may turn to violence, they may encourage a coup, they may back a return or a turn to dictatorship. This is all very, very real. It's not just an academic exercise. We've been discussing this partly in the context of Tunisia and Egypt. And I gave you the quote from Egypt, where the woman was so disillusioned with the result because she expected her party to prevail. And not only did that party lose very, very soundly, but parties that she felt were unpatriotic and uncountrylike prevailed. And as a result, she withdrew her support for democracy. So these voters, these supporters of losing parties face this critical choice, and they must remain within the democratic system if democracy is to survive, or if a nascent democracy is to grow and evolve and consolidate eventually, as in Tunisia, perhaps in the next decade. If they don't, we run the risk of violence, perhaps a coup. We really could risk the survival of the democracy itself. And this is where I'd like us to pause and step back. And I want to have a frank and genuine conversation about the United States. And my question for you is the United States vulnerable to this kind of defection from democracy? And why or why not? And this gives us a moment and a chance to pause and step back and reflect on the US experience, especially in the last few months, and think about this critical choice, this strategic choice, right, between defection or loyalty. And so I'll repeat the question, and I hope that you will engage me and indulge me. Is the US vulnerable to this kind of defection from democracy? Why or why not? Hey, Ishan.
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely um, vulnerable to such defection. January 6th, obviously being the most obvious example, but also the idea that there's very few competitive districts and states all across the country. So it leads to hyper partisanship in those states that aren't competitive. And then when the elections nationally are close in favor of one party or the other, it becomes easier to sort of be confused because what you're seeing in your local cities or your local states even isn't what's reflective of the country or the demographics of the country as a whole.
Yeah, that's an excellent response. Thank you, Ishan. There's so much there, and first and most evidently, there's obviously January 6th, and I hope that we'll continue to sort of unravel that and elaborate on that. But maybe less obviously, but equally importantly, there's the simple fact that there are so few truly competitive districts nationally, and so what this means then is there are often very rigid expectations about the winner will be and who the loser will be. And in those few districts that are competitive, sure, things might go a variety of ways. But in those cases where the usual winner expects to win but does not, we may particularly run a risk of defection from democracy. And I think that even another layer of this that's sort of inherent in that response from Ishan is the simple fact that many of the actions we've seen in recent years have deepened gerrymandering, other tactics that are supposed to tilt the playing field, make districts less competitive. These are all taking place in response to increased competition, right? In a perception of threat or a potential loss of a constituency or a district that previously was a stronghold for a party. Now, it is true that both parties do it, but the Republican Party seems to do it more. And gerrymandering in the form of either packing or cracking is always disastrous for democracy, but especially for minority groups whose votes are often broken up and fragmented for the purpose of making districts less competitive, often precisely in response to their political mobilization by parties. And so all of this works together. In the US case is quite illustrative for all these reasons. But I think that I'm hopefully opening us up to a discussion that will go further with when I say something about January 6th and how this was a critical moment for the choice between loyalty or defection. And before I go to the chat, I'd like to give the floor over to anyone who would want to take the mic and make a comment about that or engage with this question a little more and reflect more. Does anyone want to continue the discussion?
Yeah, so I was thinking that the US is already suffering from disillusionment for the very same reasons Ishan mentioned, just that we saw it in a bigger form during January 6th.
Do you think that disillusionment, Virginia, is a product of the sort of
Mhm.
unfulfilled expectations that we're talking about? Do you think that that's part of the equation?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was feeling because of the US's low voter turnout and how people tend to sort of like have this really negative view that like, oh, votes don't matter, or that, why go vote if only these two parties are the majority, and sort of mentality such as that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Virginia. And so to connect these 2 points from Ishan and Virginia, I think it's noteworthy that oftentimes the disillusionment is itself a result of the changes that parties make to the system so as to entrench their rule and make it more difficult for the other party to prevail. And so let me give you an example. Many of you may know that the Democratic Party represents like 25, 30 million more people than the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, no, the Senate, excuse me. But even so, it's still pretty much an even balance of power. And despite a significant difference between how many people those two parties represent, it's very difficult to move the needle politically and get anything done because the balance of power is essentially deadlocked. And this is the case despite that the Democratic Party represents and typically gains many, many more votes than the Republican Party. And so often Democratic voters become disillusioned, and they ask questions like, why isn't the Senate or the House capable of producing more legislative victories? Why aren't they able to increase my minimum wage? Why is it that they can't produce sane, accessible, basic healthcare? Why is it that they can't address these basic issues in infrastructure or education? It's because oftentimes minority rule has been entrenched by gerrymandering, by all of the different tactics that have been used to fight back when they begin to lose ground politically in elections. And so we don't have to whisper about it. It is true. The disillusionment with democracy is a result of unfulfilled expectations, but unfulfilled expectations themselves are a result of the deliberate actions of parties and politicians to entrench their own advantage or their own position. And so there's a lot here, and it's not just the United States that's subject to this. Make no mistake, legislative majorities, coalitions, especially ones that fear that they won't win again, always try to lock in their advantage. They always create supermajorities or new hurdles or obstacles so that any legislation they leave behind can't be overturned or undone once they leave, even if they don't win elections again. This is the oldest trick in the book. And the point that comes from this more generally is that elections, parties, and democracy are all intimately linked. And parties can promote democracy by mobilizing voters and by connecting voters to the political system, but they can also erode democracy by tilting the playing field and by entrenching their power, and often when they're in the minority, and making it difficult to govern or produce changes that would make a material improvement in people's lives. So Chile is another country where, despite overwhelming electoral victories by the left, they can't, at least historically, reform the constitution because of supermajorities left behind by the dictatorship and upheld by the narrow right-wing minority that never won an election for 18 years after the transition to democracy, but was able to keep the authoritarian order in place more or less. Now, the update to the story is that it took a popular uprising and a massive explosion of unrest to force the hand of the elected government in the initiation of a constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution. So what the legislature and the left in government could not do, popular protest and mobilization could do. And so that's an interesting story. There's a lot there, but let me go to the chat and consider some of the comments from students in the class. Alex says, I feel like we are most vulnerable since it is a two-party system. Either your team wins or your rival wins or your rival wins. But Alex, even if we have a two-party system, there's nothing about that that implies that the loser will withdraw from democracy, right? That the loser might still come back the next time, for another go at it. And I think that was the way it worked, at least for a long time. And many would argue that the heyday of American politics, as far as competitive elections are concerned, really kind of ended in the 70s and the 80s when gerrymandering became the big problem. But for many years, there was that tacit and unspoken acceptance of the logic of democratic rule in elections and how the loser would return for another go at it, despite their expectations and despite how they thought they would fare. So I don't know. I think we can still work with a two-party system. I think that it may have partly to do with the goals and the means and the strategies of the parties, right? Perhaps undemocratic parties, small d, not big D, beget undemocratic systems. But Alex, I will grant to you that a two-party system can lock the population into this struggle that can be very unproductive, right? When there's that sort of a relationship, it can create deadlock without a doubt. Brittany says, while I do not think it is necessarily likely, of course it's a possibility to be vulnerable. Just look at the storming of the Capitol after Biden won, despite the fact that the last 4 years came with intense hardships. Partisan loyalties have opened up a weakness in American democracy. And Alex says, and the loser will always call foul in some way, in my opinion. Is that true though? I mean, I'm always, virtually always the first one to be cynical. But I don't know if it's always the case that the loser will call foul. I think that generally speaking, that has not been the norm. Generally, we've accepted the results of elections. We haven't questioned the integrity of the process itself. That was partly why January 6th, in the big lie about the stolen election, were such an affront, because they struck at the very spirit of the system that everyone seemed to recognize in that moment could not recognize. Grace says, I think that in the age of social media and conspiracy theories, the US is vulnerable to defection. Yeah, without a doubt. Listen, everybody, we're out of time and I've kept you well after. Sorry about that. But very good to see you, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you on Monday.